My husband's mistress moved into my house before I knew we were divorcing. The first sign that my husband had replaced me was not the unfamiliar silver SUV in my driveway. It was the brass nameplate screwed beneath my mailbox. Evan and Celeste, it said, in neat black letters, as if I had become a forwarding error at the house I had owned for 11 years. I had been away for 37 days, overseeing the emergency restoration of a hotel in Vancouver. Evan knew the project mattered to me. I was a forensic construction consultant, which meant companies called me after water, fire, fraud, or negligence had turned an expensive building into an argument. The Vancouver job involved all four. Evan had complained about the length of the assignment, then told me not to worry about home. He sent short messages every evening, watered-down versions of affection that I mistook for a tired marriage going through a difficult season. My key no longer fit the front door. For a few seconds, I stood on the porch with my suitcase beside me, thinking I had somehow chosen the wrong key. Then I noticed that the antique bronze lock I had installed after my mother died had been replaced by a cheap brushed steel keypad. Through the glass panel, I could see my entry table, my blue ceramic bowl, and a white handbag resting where I always put my work satchel. I rang the bell. A woman I had never met opened the door, wearing my cream cashmere cardigan. She was perhaps 30, 6 or 7 years younger than I was, with carefully waved blonde hair and a cautious expression that changed to recognition before I said my name. That recognition frightened me more than surprise would have. Behind her, the house had been edited. The framed photograph from my wedding was gone. A large canvas of Evan and this woman stood above the console instead. My grandmother's rug had been rolled halfway under a new velvet bench, and 2 unopened boxes marked Celeste, primary bedroom, waited beside the staircase. The woman asked what I was doing there. I told her I lived there. She stared at me as though I were being deliberately cruel. Then Evan appeared at the top of the stairs, barefoot, fastening the cuff of a shirt I had bought him. He did not look guilty. He looked inconvenienced. He came down slowly and told Celeste to go into the kitchen. She did not. She folded her arms inside my cardigan and remained between me and my front hall. Evan said he had planned to explain everything after I settled back in the city. The sentence was absurd enough that I almost laughed. I asked why my lock had been changed. He said the old mechanism had jammed. I asked why another woman was living in my house. He said the divorce had made the living arrangements complicated. That was how I learned I was getting divorced, from my husband, while his mistress stood on my rug and wore my clothes. According to Evan, we had been separated for months. According to him, I had ignored repeated letters from his attorney. According to him, the court had accepted service at the furnished apartment my company rented for field assignments, and a default hearing was less than 2 weeks away. He spoke in the calm, regretful cadence of a man explaining weather damage. He said Celeste had moved in only after he believed our marriage was legally over in every way that mattered. I asked to see the papers. He said his lawyer had them. I asked for the lawyer's name. He hesitated for half a second, then gave me the name of a small family law practice across town. That half-second told me more than everything else. Evan had always been good at prepared lies. Unexpected details made him blink. I did not force my way through the door. The house was mine, but a physical confrontation would have given Evan the scene he wanted. An angry, unstable wife returning after an alleged abandonment. I lifted my suitcase, stepped back onto the porch, and told him I would contact counsel. Celeste looked relieved. Evan looked triumphant. Neither understood that leaving the porch was not surrender. It was the moment I stopped being his wife and became an investigator. I drove 3 blocks before pulling into a grocery store parking lot. My hands shook so badly I could not type. I called my oldest friend Priya Shah, who was also the attorney who had handled the probate transfer when my mother left me the house. Priya listened without interrupting, then asked 3 precise questions. Had I ever signed divorce papers? No. Had I authorized anyone to accept service for me? No. Was my name still on the deed? As far as I knew, yes. She told me not to communicate with Evan except in writing and not to enter the house until she checked the court docket. She booked me a room under her firm's corporate account and met me there 90 minutes later with her laptop. The petition existed. It had been filed 26 days after I left for Vancouver. Evan claimed we had separated 8 months earlier, even though our joint calendar, travel receipts, photographs, and messages showed we had taken an anniversary trip during that period. He claimed I had permanently relocated for work and had refused to disclose my residence. A process server swore that the papers had been delivered to a furnished apartment in Portland, more than 300 miles from my project site, and accepted by a woman described as my adult roommate. I had never lived in Portland. Attached to the petition was a proposed property schedule. It identified our home as marital property and valued it far below market price. It said Evan had contributed substantially to the mortgage and renovations and should receive exclusive possession pending sale. It did not mention that my mother had purchased the house years before I met him, that I inherited it outright, or that every major renovation had been paid from my separate account. More disturbing was a declaration supposedly sent from my email address. It said I did not contest temporary possession and wanted all communication routed through a private mailbox. The language sounded vaguely like me because it borrowed phrases from old work emails. The signature was not mine. Priya enlarged the document and pointed to the electronic audit stamp. It had been signed from an internet address associated with our home. Evan had sat inside my house and manufactured my consent. The court had not granted the divorce, despite what he implied. It had issued only a temporary occupancy order based on his unchallenged declarations, and even that order did not transfer ownership. The default hearing was scheduled in 11 days. Priya prepared an emergency motion to set aside the false service, preserve the property, and prohibit transfers or new debt. She also told me to call the lender listed on my original title records. The lender informed me that no mortgage remained. I had paid it off 3 years earlier. Then the representative paused and asked whether I was calling about the pending home equity line. Someone had applied to borrow $850,000 against my house. The application used my social security number, a scan of my passport, and a financial statement copied from a confidential package I had prepared for a business acquisition. It also included a quitclaim deed purporting to transfer a half interest to Evan. The signature looked convincing at first glance. It even contained the small upward hook I made at the end of my surname, but it was dated while I was presenting at a conference in Singapore. My passport records, hotel key logs, and the conference live stream could prove I was 9,000 miles away. The notary acknowledgement said I had appeared in person at a suburban shipping store 20 minutes from our house. Priya placed an immediate fraud alert with the lender and county recorder. The loan had not funded, but it was scheduled to close in 4 days. I understood then why Celeste had moved in so quickly. She was not merely occupying my side of the bed. Her presence helped Evan create a picture of settled domestic possession while he converted my home into cash. If the loan funded before I appeared, the money could vanish into accounts the court would spend years chasing. I spent that first night in a hotel room with my suitcase unopened. Grief arrived in layers. Evan's affair, his contempt, the loss of my private space, and the colder realization that he had been gathering documents long before I left. Every photograph he had taken of my passport, every time he volunteered to collect the mail, every question about my company statements now looked different. I wanted to call him and demand an explanation. Instead, I downloaded our message history and made a timeline. That habit had saved clients millions. Buildings rarely failed in one dramatic instant. Someone ignored moisture, substituted material, altered a report, or concealed a crack. By the time a ceiling collapsed, the causes had been accumulating quietly for months. My marriage was another damaged structure. I could not repair it, but I could document how it had been sabotaged. The timeline showed Evan had encouraged the Vancouver assignment from the beginning. He had forwarded the project announcement to me, praised the career opportunity, and suggested I extend my stay when delays arose. 3 days before I left, he asked me to update the emergency folder containing my passport copy, tax returns, insurance documents, and deed. He said it would help if something happened while I was away. He changed the locks 12 days after my departure. Our smart home account had emailed me a security notice, but a filter moved it into an archive folder. The filter had been created from my laptop the morning after Evan used it to print boarding passes. Fortunately, deleting the app from my phone had not erased the cloud history. The system recorded every lock change, user code, thermostat adjustment, and door opening. Celeste received a permanent access code before the divorce petition was filed. Her code had been used overnight several times while I was still sleeping in the house. That discovery hurt in a way the legal fraud did not. Money and documents were evidence. The access log was intimacy turned into timestamps. It showed that when I traveled for 2-day inspections, another woman entered through my kitchen door after midnight and left before dawn. On one occasion, she arrived 20 minutes after Evan kissed me goodbye at the airport. I forwarded the history to Priya and did not look at it again. The next morning, we went to the county recorder's office. The quitclaim deed had been submitted electronically by a title company called Northline Settlement Services. Its registered manager was a man named Adrian Rowe. Celeste's last name, according to the social media profile I found, was Rowe. Adrian was her brother. Northline had opened only 14 months earlier. Its office was a rented suite with no permanent staff, and its website used photographs copied from an architectural firm in Denmark. Public filings showed Adrian had previously worked in mortgage processing until he was dismissed after an internal compliance investigation. He had not been charged with a crime, but his license application omitted that employment. The proposed borrower on the equity line was not simply Evan. It was a newly formed company called EB Residential Holdings. Evan owned 51%. Celeste owned 49%. If the closing had proceeded, my forged deed would have allowed Evan to pledge the house, the lender would have wired the money to Northline, and Northline would have distributed most of it to a business he shared with his mistress. They were turning my inheritance into their starting capital. Priya contacted the police financial crimes unit, but she warned me that criminal investigations move slowly. Our emergency civil hearing would come first. To protect the house, we needed proof that the deed and service were fraudulent. To expose the larger plan, we needed records Evan believed were still under his control. He helped us by becoming impatient. That afternoon, he sent an email demanding that I remove remaining personal effects within 48 hours. He attached an inventory prepared by Celeste. The list described most of my belongings as abandoned and assigned them estimated resale values. My mother's walnut desk was valued at $200. A collection of first-edition engineering books was valued at $50. Jewelry was missing entirely. The email also said failure to retrieve the property would be treated as confirmation that I had permanently vacated. Priya replied that I disputed every allegation, had never been lawfully served, and would collect essential items with a civil standby. She asked Evan to preserve all property and electronic records. That preservation notice mattered. From that moment, destroying evidence could carry consequences beyond the original misconduct. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy met me at the house. Celeste opened the door in a linen dress and acted as if she were hosting an inspection. She had removed the brass nameplate, but the screw holes were still visible. Evan stood behind her, recording me with his phone. I recorded too. The living room no longer contained my photographs. My books had been boxed and stacked in the garage. Celeste had arranged framed images of herself on the mantel, including one from a beach vacation dated 4 months earlier. On the kitchen counter sat mail addressed to EB Residential Holdings. I collected clothes, medication, my grandmother's jewelry box, and the external drive from my office. The jewelry box was empty. Evan claimed he did not know where the contents were. Celeste said the box had been empty when she moved it. Their answers came too quickly and contradicted the inventory, which described the box as assorted costume jewelry. I photographed the empty drawers. While doing so, I noticed a pale rectangle on the wall behind my desk. A small framed watercolor had been removed. Behind it had been a recessed data port connected to the home network. Evan knew about the port, but he had never known why I kept a compact backup device inside the locked cabinet below it. The cabinet had been forced open. The device was gone. Evan must have believed he had removed the local archive of my work files and security footage. What he did not know was that the device synchronized nightly to an encrypted account managed by my company. Its disappearance created evidence of tampering without depriving me of the data. I said nothing. I finished packing one suitcase and left. Back at the hotel, our technical director restored the archive. It contained doorbell video, network logs, and snapshots from 2 interior cameras I had installed after a contractor stole equipment during a renovation. I had disabled the interior cameras for privacy, but the network controllers still recorded when devices connected. Celeste's phone first joined our network 7 months earlier. Adrian's laptop connected 5 weeks before the Vancouver trip. Its device name included Northline Admin. On the evening the forged deed was signed, that laptop remained connected for nearly 6 hours. The printer log showed 43 pages, including files named Quitclaim Final, Occupancy Mockeration, and Lydia Signal. The file names were not the documents themselves, but they mapped the work. My husband had used my electricity, my internet, and my printer to design the theft of my house. The doorbell archive provided something even better. The notary named on the deed had visited our home twice. During the second visit, Celeste answered the door, signed a delivery screen, and led her inside. I was in Singapore. Evan later claimed the notary had independently verified me through a video call, but the deed stated personal appearance, and there was no authorized remote notarization certificate. Priya subpoenaed the notary's journal on an emergency basis. The notary, faced with video placing her at the property and a signature that could not be mine, retained counsel and admitted Adrian had paid her to complete several acknowledgments without the named signers present. She claimed Evan told her I had consented and was simply unavailable. Her journal contained my forged signature and a thumbprint. The thumbprint belonged to Celeste. I learned that fact later, after investigators confirmed it during the criminal case. At the time, the visible difference was enough. I had a scar across my left thumb from a childhood accident. The print in the journal showed an unbroken ridge pattern. Our emergency hearing occurred 6 days after I found the nameplate. Evan arrived with an attorney who seemed to have received only part of the story. His argument rested on the idea that our marriage had broken down, I traveled constantly, and Evan reasonably believed he could manage the household. None of that explained the false address, forged declaration, fabricated deed, or pending loan. Priya presented the travel records first, then the security history, printer logs, doorbell stills, title company connections, and lender affidavit. She showed that Celeste had a permanent access code months before the alleged separation, that her brother submitted the deed, and that the proceeds were intended for a company she owned with Evan. The judge asked Evan whether he had ever spoken to me about divorce before filing. He said he had, many times. Priya displayed our complete message history from the dates he identified. It contained discussions of groceries, dinner with friends, the Vancouver project, and a possible trip to Greece. There was no mention of separation. 2 messages from Evan ended with declarations of love. The judge asked why he served me in Portland. Evan said he believed I was staying there. Priya displayed his airline loyalty account, which he had used to purchase my flight to Vancouver, and the hotel confirmation he had forwarded to me. He knew my exact city, hotel, and return date. By the end of the hearing, the temporary occupancy order had been vacated. The default hearing was canceled. The court froze the proposed loan, prohibited either party from transferring property, ordered preservation of all records, and granted me exclusive temporary possession because I was the record owner, and Evan's claim depended on a deed now under fraud investigation. The judge gave Evan and Celeste 72 hours to leave. I expected relief. Instead, I felt dread. Winning access to a house did not restore it. Every room had become proof of a life conducted behind my back. Evan did not use the 72 hours to pack honestly. He removed electronics, artwork, wine, tools, and several boxes from my office. The exterior cameras captured a rental truck arriving after midnight. Because of the preservation order, Priya filed an immediate notice. Deputies stopped the truck before it left the county. Inside were my backup device, my mother's silver, company records, 2 hard drives, and a lockbox containing the missing jewelry. There were also boxes of Northline files. Celeste later claimed she thought everything belonged to Evan. That explanation might have worked for furniture. It did not work for jewelry engraved with my mother's initials or folders marked Lydia Bennett, confidential. The Northline boxes changed the case. Investigators found draft property schedules with different values, copies of my identification, signature practice sheets, and emails discussing how quickly a lender could fund after a default order. One spreadsheet labeled Exit Plan divided the proposed loan proceeds. Adrian would receive a processing fee, Celeste would receive money for a boutique interior design studio, and Evan would use the rest to purchase 4 rental properties through EB Residential Holdings. Another column was labeled L, Exposure. It listed my expected legal response as low until return, and estimated that I would accept a cash settlement rather than risk professional embarrassment. That was Evan's central miscalculation. He believed humiliation would make me quiet. For years, I had protected his image. When his marketing consultancy lost its largest client, I told friends he was restructuring. When he borrowed money and missed repayment dates, I called it a temporary cash flow problem. When he became resentful of my income, I declined promotions that required more travel. I thought privacy was loyalty. Evan treated it as training. Each time I covered a crack, he learned I would stand beneath the ceiling and pretend it was safe. The financial records showed his consultancy had been insolvent for nearly a year. He owed taxes, private lenders, and a former business partner. Celeste had not moved into my house only because they wanted to live together. They needed an address that suggested stability while seeking money. She styled rooms for lender photographs, replaced my personal items, and signed utility accounts in her name. They planned to use the house as both collateral and proof that their new company possessed valuable assets. Celeste was not as innocent as she first portrayed herself. Her attorney initially described her as a woman deceived by a married man who said the divorce was complete. The security records disproved that. She had entered my home while I lived there. Messages recovered from her seized phone showed that she knew I had not been served. She complained about waiting for me to disappear long enough and suggested the Portland address because a college friend still rented the apartment. That friend was the woman who claimed to accept service as my roommate. Bank records showed Celeste sent her $2,000 the following day. The process server had delivered an envelope, but not to me. He relied on information provided by Evan's filing service and did not know the recipient was lying. Once investigators showed him my photograph, he confirmed immediately that the woman at the apartment was someone else. Evan's attorney withdrew after learning that several declarations his client supplied were fabricated. A new lawyer adopted a narrower strategy. Evan admitted mistakes but claimed emotional desperation. He said our marriage had been over in substance, that he feared I would use my wealth to leave him with nothing, and that the deed was intended only to document his equitable interest. The argument offended me because it converted planning into panic. Panic did not form a company with ownership percentages. Panic did not rehearse signatures, hire a dishonest notary, redirect court papers, and schedule a loan closing around an international trip. The discovery process exposed another part of the plan that never reached the closing table. Evan had applied for a life insurance policy on me through a broker who handled coverage for his company. The amount was $2 million. Spouses commonly insure one another, and the application alone was not criminal. But he had answered medical and travel questions in my name and listed EB Residential Holdings as a contingent beneficiary. The electronic consent came from the same home internet address used for the false divorce declaration. The insurer had suspended the application because my medical authorization was incomplete. Evan told the broker I was difficult to reach overseas and asked whether temporary coverage could begin while the signature issue was resolved. It never did. Still, seeing my life reduced to another column in their financial plan altered the emotional scale of what had happened. Investigators found no evidence that anyone intended physical harm, and I did not pretend otherwise. The policy mattered because it demonstrated habit. Whenever Evan encountered an asset connected to me, he looked for a way to place his hand between ownership and payment. Priya advised me not to let the insurance issue dominate our case. Strong cases can become weaker when every disturbing fact is presented as equally decisive. We used it to support the identity theft pattern, then returned to the clean sequence surrounding the house. That discipline became important as Evan scattered accusations in every direction. He claimed I had hidden marital income, abused him financially, and used my professional influence to pressure investigators. He produced a diary describing years of supposed control. The entries were handwritten, but the notebook model had not been manufactured until 3 months before our separation. A stationery company confirmed the production date from a lot code on the back cover. Several entries described weather that did not occur and dinners at restaurants that were closed on the dates given. I learned not to experience every new allegation as a fresh betrayal. At first, each filing ruined an entire day. I would read one sentence and begin mentally defending every decision I had made during 9 years of marriage. My therapist taught me to separate emotional response from evidentiary response. I could feel wounded without allowing the wound to dictate strategy. Priya's team created a table with 4 columns: allegation, supporting evidence, contradictory evidence, and legal relevance. Most of Evan's attacks looked enormous in prose and almost weightless in the table. The claim of financial abuse was especially revealing. Evan described our separate accounts as something I imposed to keep him dependent. Bank records showed that we adopted them after he used joint tax money to cover a business debt without telling me. I had then created a household account that I funded at nearly 4 times his contribution. It paid the utilities, food, travel, insurance, and repairs. He kept his remaining income and received free use of a house without a mortgage. What he called control had often been a boundary introduced after an earlier breach. That pattern helped me understand why I had remained confused for so long. Evan never argued against the original facts. He argued against the consequences. If I noticed missing money, the real problem became my suspicious nature. If I protected an account, the protection became evidence that I did not trust him. If I traveled to earn the income supporting us, the travel became abandonment. He converted every response to his conduct into permission for the next act. During mediation, before the criminal indictment, his lawyer offered to withdraw the house claim if I waived reimbursement and agreed not to assist police. The proposal was framed as a way to end a painful, private matter. Priya ended the session immediately. Property negotiations could not purchase silence about suspected crimes, and the request itself was documented. Evan followed me into the hallway and said we could still prevent strangers from defining our marriage. It was one of the few times we spoke directly after the porch. I looked at the glass conference room wall behind him and saw our reflections separated by a strip of metal. I told him strangers had not forged my name. Then I walked away. The failed mediation clarified my goal. I was not fighting to persuade Evan that he had hurt me. I was fighting to keep the legal record from rewarding what he had done. Those were different tasks. The first depended on his capacity for honesty. The second depended on evidence. I returned to the house on a gray Monday morning. The keypad had been removed, leaving splintered wood around the doorframe. Inside, the air smelled of Celeste's perfume and fresh paint. She had turned my office into a dressing room. My diplomas were stacked face down in a closet, and a gold clothing rack stood where my drafting table had been. In the bedroom, half the closet was empty, and the other half contained wire hangers. They had taken the new linens but left my old ones in garbage bags. On the kitchen wall, faint pencil marks recorded design measurements. Celeste had written possible changes directly on the plaster. Open shelves, marble, remove Lydia tile. The tile had been made by my mother. She was a ceramic artist who distrusted perfection. Each blue square contained a tiny variation in glaze, and one near the stove carried her thumbprint. I had designed the kitchen around those tiles after inheriting the house. Celeste's plan to remove them hurt more than the missing television or damaged lock, because it revealed how completely she expected me to vanish. I did not erase the pencil notes. I photographed them for the case, then covered the wall with clear protective film. For months, those words remained under plastic, evidence and insult preserved together. I changed every lock, password, and account. A locksmith rekeyed the doors while a digital forensics team imaged the recovered devices. I hired an inventory company to document each room. The process felt clinical, which helped. I could not decide how to feel about my marriage, but I could label a missing lamp, date a damaged cabinet, and calculate replacement costs. Neighbors slowly told me what they had seen. Evan had introduced Celeste as his fiancée before filing the divorce petition. He told one neighbor I had taken a permanent position in Canada. He told another that the house belonged to his family and I had refused a fair settlement. Celeste hosted a dinner for potential investors 3 days before I returned. Guests toured the property while Adrian described upcoming renovations and rental acquisitions. One neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, had saved a package addressed to me because she distrusted Evan's explanation that I no longer wanted my mail. The package contained a renewal notice from my identity monitoring service. It had been slit open and taped closed. Mrs. Alvarez also had video from her driveway camera. It showed Evan carrying boxes from my office to Adrian's car weeks before the purported service. Later footage showed Celeste and a photographer staging the front entrance for EB Residential's investor materials. The brass nameplate appeared for the first time in those images. The nameplate had not been a romantic gesture. It was part of the asset presentation. That realization stripped away one of the last sentimental explanations I had unconsciously offered them. Even the cruelty was operational. The divorce itself proceeded separately from the fraud investigation. Once proper service occurred, I responded and sought dissolution based on the financial misconduct. Evan demanded a share of the house, reimbursement for improvements, and spousal support. He submitted receipts claiming he had paid for renovations, totaling more than $400,000. I recognized the projects. I did not recognize the payments. My team examined the receipts. Several vendors did not exist. Others were real companies whose invoice numbers had been copied from unrelated jobs. One legitimate contractor confirmed that his $38,000 invoice had been altered to read $138,000. Evan was trying to transform forged expenses into equity. Construction fraud was my field. He had selected the worst possible person to deceive with fabricated renovation records. I traced every improvement back to permits, canceled checks, supplier deliveries, and dated photographs. My separate account paid the roof, kitchen, windows, drainage, and foundation work. Evan had contributed to cosmetic projects worth less than $12,000, most completed as gifts during the marriage. Even those purchases were partly reimbursed from our joint household account. His demand collapsed under documentation. Then my forensic team found a folder on the recovered backup device called House Options. Evan had copied my original deed, my mother's probate documents, and a legal memorandum Priya wrote years earlier explaining that the house was separate property. The file had been opened 17 times. He had not misunderstood ownership. He had studied it. The metadata showed Celeste also opened the memorandum from her laptop. In messages with Adrian, she summarized the problem accurately. The house could not be divided unless they created evidence of transfer, contribution, or consent. Adrian replied that possession plus a recorded deed would pressure me to settle even if the deed was later challenged. They did not believe the fraud was lawful. They believed reversing it would be exhausting. They were right about the exhaustion. For nearly a year, my days divided into work, legal meetings, therapy, and repairs. I woke at 3 in the morning, remembering another account Evan might access. I checked the recorder's portal compulsively. I avoided restaurants we had visited together and stopped answering unknown numbers because reporters began calling after criminal charges were filed. Evan was charged with attempted mortgage fraud, identity theft, forgery, perjury, and conspiracy. Adrian faced similar charges plus licensing violations. The notary accepted a plea agreement and agreed to testify. Celeste was charged with conspiracy, identity theft, and making false statements in the service scheme. People who knew us wanted a simple, emotional explanation. They asked whether Evan had always been cruel or whether Celeste manipulated him. The truth was less satisfying. Evan could be generous when generosity cost less than honesty. He remembered birthdays, cooked breakfast, and sat beside my mother during chemotherapy. He also kept a hidden ledger of resentment in which every success of mine became something stolen from him. Celeste did not create that resentment. She gave it admiration and a business plan. Recovered messages showed how their relationship evolved. At first, she praised his ideas and described him as underappreciated. Later, she encouraged him to view my property as compensation for years spent supporting me. By the end, their messages were less about love than projected returns, renovation budgets, and the timing of my travel. Their romance depended on a future purchased with my past. The criminal trial began 14 months after I found them at the door. By then, the divorce court had already confirmed the house as my separate property, denied Evan's reimbursement claim, and ordered him to pay a substantial portion of my attorney and forensic fees. The marriage was legally dissolved without ceremony. I received the final order by email while sitting at my mother's kitchen table, the one piece of furniture Celeste's movers had not damaged. Before the trial, I visited the house with the prosecutor and walked through the sequence one last time. We began at the mailbox, crossed the porch, and entered the hall where Celeste had stood in my cardigan. I showed her the sightline to the kitchen camera, the forced cabinet in my office, and the wall where the design notes remained beneath plastic. She did not ask me to make the story more dramatic. She asked which facts I had personally observed and which I learned later. That distinction mattered. Trauma compresses time. In my memory, the nameplate, false deed, empty jewelry box, and loan application sometimes appeared as a single discovery. Under oath, I needed to rebuild the correct order. I practiced saying that I did not know a fact until the date a record revealed it. Precision protected the truth better than certainty performed too broadly. On the morning I testified, I wore a navy suit with pockets and carried no jewelry. The courthouse hallway was crowded with people from other cases whose lives had also become folders and hearing times. That ordinary bureaucracy steadied me. My case felt like the center of my world, but the court required it to become specific, limited, and provable. Evan's lawyer questioned why I had left the porch instead of entering my own home. The suggestion was that a true owner, or a truly shocked wife, would have forced a confrontation. I explained that my work involved preserving unstable scenes. When conditions are uncertain, adding force can destroy evidence and injure people. I knew the deed would not change because I stepped backward. I knew a recording of me pushing past Celeste could change how everything after it was perceived. He asked whether I had ever told Evan the house was ours. I had. Marriage contains language that is not a title instrument. I called it our home because I wanted him to feel safe there, not because I intended to transfer an inherited asset. The prosecutor later displayed the legal memorandum Evan had opened 17 times. Whatever tenderness existed in my everyday language, he knew the legal reality. The most difficult exhibit was not a forged document. It was a photograph from our anniversary trip, taken during the period Evan later called an 8-month separation. We were standing beside a lake, his arm around me, both smiling. The defense used it to suggest our marriage was complicated and that I might have misunderstood private discussions about ending it. To me, the picture demonstrated how fully he could occupy 2 stories at once. I answered the questions, identified the messages, and stepped down. The testimony lasted less than 3 hours. I had spent more than a year preparing for it, yet the decisive power did not come from a perfect speech. It came from records created before any of us knew a jury would see them. I thought the divorce decree would feel like release. It felt like an accurate label attached to something already dead. At trial, prosecutors built the case in the same order I had lived it: the false story of separation, the redirected service, the staged occupancy, the forged deed, and the loan closing. Each act supported the next. The nameplate appeared in an enlarged photograph on a courtroom screen. I watched jurors study those two names as evidence of intent. Celeste testified under an immunity-limited cooperation agreement after Adrian decided to blame both her and Evan. She admitted knowing the divorce was not final when she moved in, but insisted Evan told her I had verbally agreed to leave. The prosecutor showed her message about needing me to disappear long enough. She said it referred only to travel. Then came the kitchen photographs. In one, Celeste stood beside the wall where she had written, "Remove Lydia tile." In another, an investor presentation described the property as founder-controlled, unencumbered residential collateral. Her thumb rested on the presentation board. The prosecutor asked why she would present my house as company collateral if she believed ownership remained unresolved. She could not give a coherent answer. Evan did not testify. His lawyer argued that Adrian designed the financial scheme and that Evan, overwhelmed by debt and divorce, followed professional advice. Emails showed otherwise. Evan chose the false address. Evan provided my identity documents. Evan wrote that the loan must close before my Vancouver project ended. In one message, he told Adrian that I was trained to find structural weaknesses, but often missed weaknesses in people. The sentence was intended as a joke. Hearing it read aloud ended something in me that the divorce decree had not. Until then, a small part of me still remembered the man who held my hand at my mother's funeral and wondered whether he had changed. The message proved he understood my trust while he exploited it. He had not failed to recognize my loyalty. He had measured it as a vulnerability. The jury convicted him on every major count. Adrian was convicted on all but one. Celeste was convicted of conspiracy and false statements, but acquitted on one identity theft count because the jury could not determine whether she personally obtained my passport copy. The notary lost her commission permanently and received probation after cooperation. At sentencing, Evan's lawyer described the loss of his marriage, home, business, and reputation as punishment already suffered. Priya leaned toward me and whispered that none of those things had been taken from him. He had spent them. I submitted a victim impact statement but did not read it aloud. It explained that property fraud is often described in numbers, while its real damage occurs in ordinary spaces. I could replace a lock, but not the instinctive safety of turning a key. I could recover jewelry, but not the privacy of knowing who had touched it. I could remove Celeste's photographs, but for months I still saw their pale outlines on the walls. The judge sentenced Evan to prison and ordered restitution jointly with Adrian and Celeste. The amount covered legal expenses, property damage, stolen items, forensic work, and costs caused by the attempted loan. It did not assign a price to betrayal. Courts are not designed to do that, and I was eventually grateful they did not try. Restitution arrived slowly through seized accounts and the sale of assets purchased with other questionable funds. EB Residential Holdings was dissolved. Northline lost its license. Adrian's rented office closed, and its copied website disappeared. Celeste sold the silver SUV that had been parked in my driveway the day I returned. I kept the brass nameplate. Investigators recovered it from one of the moving boxes. For a long time it remained sealed in an evidence bag. When the case ended, an officer asked whether I wanted it destroyed. I brought it home instead and placed it in the bottom drawer of my mother's desk. Keeping it was not nostalgia. It reminded me how confidently a false story can be installed. 4 screws and 2 names had announced a finished reality. They belonged, I had left, the house was theirs. For 10 minutes on that porch, I had almost allowed the certainty of their performance to overpower what I knew. The deed was mine. The history was mine. The life inside the house had been mine even while they rearranged it. I spent the following year restoring the property, but I refused to return it exactly to its former state. Replication would have turned every room into a shrine to what Evan damaged. Instead, I made deliberate changes. The bedroom became a light-filled studio. The dressing room became my office again, with stronger cabinets and a window seat. I replaced the damaged front door with oak and installed a lock whose access belonged only to me. I kept my mother's blue kitchen tiles. The pencil words beneath the protective film stayed until the criminal case ended. Then, I invited my mother's former studio assistant to help me repair the wall. We removed the film, cleaned the plaster, and painted around every tile. Above the one carrying my mother's thumbprint, I added a narrow shelf for her favorite bowl. Mrs. Alvarez attended the small dinner I held after the work was finished. Priya came with flowers and placed them in the blue bowl by the door. No one called it a housewarming because the house had never stopped being mine. We called it dinner. My work changed too. I began consulting on fraud risks involving property restoration and contractor access. I had once thought of security as locks, insurance, and technical controls. My experience taught me that the most dangerous access often comes from trust granted without limits. I developed protocols for clients separating personal identity records from household devices, verifying deed alerts, and preserving digital logs during disputes. I did not turn my betrayal into a motivational brand. I did not tell audiences that everything happened for a reason. It happened because 3 people believed paperwork could erase me faster than I could return. What I could choose was whether their plan became the defining architecture of my life. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter from Celeste. She had completed a short custodial sentence and was working through the restitution order. The letter contained an apology surrounded by explanations. Evan's promises, Adrian's pressure, her financial fear, her belief that I had already abandoned the marriage. She wrote that living in my house had made it easy to imagine she was stepping into an empty role. I read the letter once. The role had never been empty. She had packed it into boxes. I did not respond. Forgiveness, if it ever came, did not require renewed access. Evan wrote twice from prison. The first letter blamed Adrian. The second was more polished and accepted what he called his share of responsibility. He asked whether I remembered the first night we slept in the house, before the furniture arrived, when rain tapped the windows and we ate takeout on the floor. I remembered. I also remembered that the house was already mine that night. I had invited him into it because I loved him. Somewhere along the way, he rewrote invitation as entitlement. I returned both letters unopened after the first pages were scanned by my attorney for compliance with the no-contact terms. There was nothing he could explain that the evidence had not already made clear. The last legal matter ended when the county recorder formally expunged the fraudulent quitclaim deed from the public chain of title. Priya and I went together to collect the certified order. The clerk stamped the final page and slid it across the counter without ceremony. Outside, Priya asked whether I felt finished. I told her no, but I felt accurate. For years, accuracy had been the foundation of my work. A building did not care what story an owner preferred. Water followed gravity. Steel carried only the load it could bear. Records, properly preserved, resisted wishful thinking. My marriage had been filled with wishful thinking. Its ending was built from facts. That evening, I walked through the house room by room. The oak door closed firmly behind me. My photographs were not all restored. I had chosen new ones. The shelves held books I loved rather than objects arranged to impress investors. My mother's desk stood beneath the window, its bottom drawer holding the nameplate no one could see. At the mailbox, there was no brass plaque, only the street number remained. I had considered adding my name, but I no longer needed the house to announce who belonged there. Belonging was recorded in more durable places. The deed, the court order, the repaired walls, the neighbors who had protected my mail, and the quiet certainty with which my key turned. Evan and Celeste moved into my house before I knew we were divorcing because they believed possession could become truth if they performed it confidently enough. They changed the locks, redirected the papers, photographed the rooms, and wrote their future across my walls. They expected me to be embarrassed. They expected me to negotiate against my own exhaustion. They expected that by the time I understood what was happening, the money would be gone and their version of events would already look permanent. What they never understood was that I had built a career from walking into damaged structures after everyone else had declared the cause unknowable. I knew how to begin, preserve the scene, follow the sequence, test every claim, and never confuse a polished surface with a sound foundation. The first lie was a nameplate. The last truth was a key turning in my own front door.